The last in our webinar series. We're going to be covering disease scouting and control this time. I've got quite a bit of material to cover. Hopefully we will get to it all and still have some time for questions, but we'll definitely hang on and answer questions after the 1 hour time limit also. My name is Amy Thompson. I am the Monroe County Ag and Natural Resources Extension Educator. So the second one down in the first column there. And I believe all my colleagues are also on today to serve as panelists and help in asking questions as we go through the program. Hopefully you've either been able to join us for all these webinars or have caught the recordings, and hopefully you've found it beneficial as you move into your gardening season for 2020. I'm going to mention it now, and I will also mention it at the end of the program. We will be sending you an evaluation of this program and would very much appreciate your feedback. We'll use that feedback to develop future programs, and we will also utilize it to show some of the folks that help fund Purdue Extension that our work has some impact. Hopefully these webinars have made an impact on you and made you feel like you've gained some gardening skills. So as I said, I'll mention that again at the end, but please do keep on the lookout for that email. We're going to jump right in. Oops, already see a little formatting issue on my slide. Sorry about that. I will credit several people with the development of this presentation. Some of it is material that I pulled together. And then I also utilized some material from Dan Eagle, who is an extension plant pathologist who works mostly in vegetables. He's stationed down at Vincennes, and in other parts are from a master gardening training curriculum that was developed by Gail Rule, who is retired from the Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Laboratory. We're going to start off with the disease definition, just to make sure that we're on the same page. So plant pathologists define a plant disease as any physiological or structural abnormality that is harmful to the plant. And if you think about that, that's a pretty broad definition. And as we go through this, you may find out some things are considered plant diseases that you may not have thought of as plant diseases. And we've got 3 plant diseases here, each of which we will talk about a little more in the presentation. I'm going to go through some basics about plant disease, what causes plant disease, a brief process that we use to try and diagnose plant disease problems. And then I'm going to cover some common problems that we see in the garden. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about control measures and pesticides that you might utilize at the end of the program. So with our plant disease definition in mind, we will move on to things that cause plant disease. So those things include pathogenic microorganisms and parasitic plants. Usually when people think of plant disease, they think of these pathogenic microorganisms. We're going to talk about several of them today. We are not going to talk about parasitic plants today. They're relatively rare and not typically a problem in vegetable gardens, but they are listed as a causal agent. Other things that cause plant disease include things like chemicals, whether that's fertilizers or pesticides, could be applying them off the label recommendations, or applying them to a crop that they're not labeled for, or drift, or lots of things. But chemicals, when used correctly, can be a very reliable tool in the toolbox, but used incorrectly can definitely harm plants. Environmental conditions are a causal agent of plant disease. Too much water, not enough water, too cold. We all probably have some plants in our own gardens that were harmed as the result of what is a very late frost and freeze last week. So that's a causal agent. Mechanical injury, maybe due to poor cultural practices or just errors, or whatever the case may be. You injuring a plant does harm the plant, or a tool injuring the plant does harm the plant. It also provides a portal for these pathogenic microorganisms to enter. And then finally, genetic variability is another causal agent that plant pathologists talk about. And we'll talk about that a little bit as well. How you can avoid plant disease problems by utilizing genetic variability. So those are the causal agents. So when plant pathologists talk about plant disease, they generally break it down into two types: infectious and non-infectious. Infectious diseases damage the plant, and the causal agent is a pathogen. Non-infectious diseases, also known as disorders, are caused by non-living, or another word for non-living is abiotic causal agents. And they include those things I just previously mentioned: environmental conditions, chemical applications, mechanical damage, and genetic factors. So, whoops, an extra slide in there. Sorry about that. As we move into these pathogenic microorganisms, which as a group are known as the plant pathogens, they're listed here. Fungi represent the largest group of causal agents. I couldn't find the exact statistic today, but I believe fungi make up about 80% of plant disease causal agents. We have bacteria here. They make up about 15%, and viruses make up about 5%. So, giving each of those percentages a little wiggle room, you can see that adds up very close to 100%. So these guys, nematodes, phytoplasms, and again, parasitic plants, represent a very small portion of the elements that are causing plant disease. And we're going to focus our talk today on fungi, bacteria, and viruses, because those are the ones that you're most likely to run into in your home garden. So when we work to diagnose plant problems, or we try and help others learn how to diagnose plant problems, we think of it as trying to put the pieces of a puzzle together. Oftentimes you don't have complete information. For example, you may have gotten transplants for your vegetable garden and you don't know exactly what it was treated with while it was in the garden center. Anyway, you ultimately want to gather enough information that you have enough pieces of the puzzle together that you can figure out what's going on, even if you don't perhaps have every little piece together. The first step in doing that is knowing the host plant and understanding what normal growth looks like for that plant. So there's lots of varieties of vegetables out there. And, you know, I hope each year as a gardener, you try and grow something new and different. But when you do that, you should understand how they grow. Perhaps they'll have a different color, which if you didn't know the variety came as a different color on the leaves or the fruit, you might instead think that's possibly a nutritional deficiency or something. So understanding how the host plant grows is really the starting point of diagnosing any plant problem. When we've got that down, we know what normal growth looks like. And we know we're looking at something that is not normal. We're going to start checking for signs and symptoms. Symptoms are the plant reaction to a causal agent, whereas signs are the actual physical causal agent. So it could be spores of this, if you were looking for examples of spores. It could be actual pieces of a fungus, or bacterial streaming, or polysaccharides that develop within plant tissues because of the presence of bacteria. When we're talking about symptoms, we're talking about things like leaf spots, wilt, blight, cankers, those kind of things. And one thing that I failed to add to my resource list, but will provide for you, is a list of signs and symptom definitions that'll help you develop a common vocabulary. So if you call one of us up to help you diagnose your plant problem, you know, you can utilize some of the vocabulary that we often use, and we'll have clearer communication from the get-go. Another thing we're going to do is we're going to look for patterns, patterns on the leaves we're observing, patterns on the plant we're observing, and then you also need to take into consideration patterns across the larger growing area / garden / landscape. And I'll give you a couple examples of that that will hopefully hit home with you and make it a little easier to see these patterns when you're out in your own garden. It is something that takes a little bit of practice and experience to get good at, but it is helpful in identifying what type of plant disease you might be dealing with. And then we're also going to ask questions. You know, you may be helping somebody else, or, you know, you may be standing in your own garden, and you may need to ask yourself questions about the plant history. You know, when did I put this in the ground? What kind of weather occurred since I put this in the ground? What, you know, treatments, fertilizers, pesticides, etc. Have I applied since this plant has been planted? When did I first notice any symptoms or signs of problems? Are those problems only on one specific type of plant, or am I noticing those problems across the garden on multiple different species of plants? So those kind of questions will also help you narrow down your puzzle pieces as you're trying to, you know, put this diagnosis puzzle together. So I'm definitely giving you an abbreviated version, and it's pretty quick and dirty. You know, you could spend whole semesters talking about this kind of stuff, but hopefully it is giving you some steps to work through as you're working in your own garden. So I mentioned earlier, when you look for patterns, the things that you're going to try and look for are whether something appears to be occurring randomly, or is it happening in a more uniform type of situation across, you know, is that again, a leaf, a plant, or across the garden? And the reason we compare random versus uniform is because the causal agents involved sort of act in different ways. If we have a living causal agent, like one of these pathogenic microorganisms, the fungi, the bacteria, the viruses, they typically produce a random pattern of symptoms, which indicates they are a living causal agent, a biotic causal agent, and therefore they are more likely to be infectious. When we're talking about things like mechanical injury or environmental conditions, those type of things tend to produce more uniform patterns. Maybe it's happening on just one side of the plant or just one side of the garden, or maybe you're seeing it across multiple species. So there's uniformity in the species that it's impacting. Those type of things are caused by, more often than not, caused by non-living causal agents. Again, chemicals, environment, genetic factors, mechanical damage, and therefore are more likely to be non-infectious. Oops. And these little schematics here hopefully help illustrate that just a little bit when we say random versus uniform. If you want to try and remember it, I grew up being a baseball fan. So RBI to me always meant, runs batted in. But when we're thinking of plant pathology, RBI, random, biotic, infectious. You see a random pattern caused by a living causal agent, a biotic causal agent, and is therefore likely to be infectious. And therefore the control options for you are going to be a little different. So if that's not clear, please type your questions in the chat and we will try to clarify that as we move along. This set of pictures here hopefully provide a little further illustration of what I'm trying to talk about. We don't have vegetable plants here, but we have the leaf of a hawthorn, and we're looking at the back side of the leaf. And looking at that leaf, those spots don't really seem to have any kind of uniformity about them. They're scattered about in a pretty random way. And from that, we would assume that it is therefore a biotic disease causal agent that is causing this problem, and therefore it's likely to be infectious and could potentially spread to other plants in our landscape. In this case, what we're talking about is cedar apple rust, which can, and there's several rust diseases related to cedar apple rust. This is cedar apple rust on hawthorn, so this is a fungal disease. And could potentially spread to apples, crab apples, that kind of thing. In contrast, this picture down here has a more uniform pattern of damage. And like I said, this takes a little practice. It may appear pretty random to you, but if you look at the leaf edges, you can see the necrosis or dead tissue that we're seeing on the leaves is pretty much contained to the leaf margins. We do have some invading a little bit here and there, but across the sample leaves that we have, it appears to be pretty uniform along the leaf margins. And therefore, we're thinking that would be an abiotic or non-living causal agent and non-infectious. So we don't have to worry about this one moving to other maples in our garden, etc. What we probably have going on here is what's known as leaf scorch. It's on a maple, obviously. And leaf scorch can occur when root damage has happened, or, if we're in a hot, dry portion of the summer, and our plants are hurting for rain. They sort of close down marginal tissues on leaves to lessen the amount they have to transpire. So this is an environmental condition that is causing this leaf scorch on these maple leaves. So hopefully that illustrates those patterns that we look for a little more as we're working in our vegetable gardens, even though we have a couple landscape examples here. Plant pathologists also talk about the disease triangle. Just because you happen to have a pathogen present in the environment does not necessarily mean that you're automatically going to get disease development. You need all three things present in the disease triangle to be happening at the same time in order for disease development to occur. So you need a susceptible host, you need the presence of a pathogen, and then you need the environmental conditions that favor the pathogen to develop within that host plant. And a lot of our favorable disease development in the landscape happens in the spring when we have cool, wet weather. Other types of diseases like powdery mildew, for example, prefer warmer temperatures, higher humidity. So all three things do need to be present for a disease to actually develop an infectious disease. And you can see the sweet spot or unsweet spot, the bitter spot of disease development here illustrated in the middle of that triangle. So we as gardeners have the opportunity to manipulate perhaps the host that we're putting out into the landscape, might do some things to lessen the presence of the pathogen or potentially alter the environment somewhat to lessen the likelihood that the pathogen can find those favorable conditions to develop. Okay, so when we talk about basic disease management, and these are specific things that you can use in the garden. First, genetic host resistance. If you listen to my warm season vegetable talk already, we talked briefly about host resistance. So selecting vegetable varieties that are resistant to some of the common disease problems will go a long way towards lessening the likelihood that you have those diseases develop. Host resistance is not 100% guaranteed that you're not going to have disease development, but it is less likely. Cultural practices are another way that we manage disease development. For example, again, if you listen to my talk on warm season vegetables, putting those crops out when soil temperatures are optimum leads to less stress on those plants, and they're therefore less likely to develop disease problems. And then, you know, chemical applications are a tool in the toolbox. Typically, we like to go through the other steps of preventing plant disease before we turn to chemicals, but they are available, and like I mentioned, I hope to talk more about them as we move through the presentation. This is just a repeat slide from my warm season vegetable presentation. These are some of the tomato disease resistance codes you will find out there. I'm not necessarily recommending that you purchase from this vendor that I'm going to mention, but Johnny's Selected Seeds out of Maine has really good information on disease resistance. And you could just check out their resources online, you know, and review that information. what types of varieties are available with what type of resistance, and not necessarily purchase from them. These are a couple of plant tags that you might see in, you know, your Lowe's, your Walmart, your Rural King. And here even you can see the disease codes that are associated with these different varieties. Celebrity is resistant to a couple different diseases. Big Beef here adds a couple more to the list. And then we have an heirloom tomato, which doesn't really have any disease resistance. So that's something to consider as you're selecting your varieties. Okay, that was, like I mentioned, a very brief overview of puzzle agents and things that you can sort of look for as you're putting together your puzzle of what's going on in your garden related to plant disease. But now we're going to move into some of the common problems that we see in gardens. And we're going to start with tomatoes. One, where there's quite a bit of tomato disease pressure in Indiana, and two, it's a favorite garden vegetable. Lots of people, if they don't grow anything else, they set out a couple of tomato plants. So one of the common diseases that we see is early blight. Typically with early blight, symptoms appear lower on the plant to start with. The lower leaves begin to turn brown and die. They'll also develop these lesions on the leaves. And with early blight, they have this sort of bullseye pattern, which you can see hopefully on this picture, which is characteristic of early blight. There are several other diseases that cause leaf spots on tomato, but early blight has the concentric rings that look like a bullseye. With this one, it typically does not impact the fruit. And if it is seen on fruit, it's typically seen on the top of fruit where water might tend to pool and allow infection to occur. If fruit is infected, it typically drops before wintering or before ripening, excuse me. The fungus which causes this disease survives over the winter in crop disease or in crop debris. So with all disease problems, if you have disease problems in your garden, sanitation, one of the cultural practices, is really important. Cleaning up your garden at the end of the gardening season, or actually if you've gotten all the production you want out of a particular plant, moving that out of the garden, any debris associated with that out of the garden at that time will help lessen the likelihood of disease problems in the future. This disease, as with other fungal diseases, often moves up the plant via rain splash. So in a rainstorm, if this is just dirt, there's no mulch around the plant, and spores are present in the dirt, when a raindrop hits the dirt, there is a pretty significant splash, and that droplet that splashes up can carry fungal spores with it, which can then land on the plant. They can find openings or wounds where the fungal pathogen can infect the plant and disease development will occur. So putting mulch down to prevent that rain splash is another way that you can prevent plant disease. If you're buying transplants, making sure they look as pristine as possible. There are resistant varieties out there for early blight, so look for those. You can prune off the lower branches as you see them start to decline and die, and that can slow the spread of the disease. And having good air circulation is important as well. Trellising, as you can see here, helps with that. but also just following recommended spacing for your plants can help with good airflow. So that you lessen the time that leaf surfaces are wet and that favorable environment for disease development is present. So on to the next disease. Another very common disease in Indiana is what's known as Septoria leaf spot. You can see these lesions here on these leaves. Typically, they do have a light gray center. Older leaves and lower leaves, again, typically show the symptoms first. Disease development in this case is favored by warm, wet weather. There aren't really resistant varieties, unfortunately, for Septoria leaf spot. So things like mulching, providing good airflow, excuse me, providing good airflow, watering from below, avoiding overhead watering is another cultural practice that can help lessen the likelihood of those leaf surfaces being wet for a prolonged period, and therefore can lessen the likelihood of disease development. There are some fungicides available, and this would apply for early blight as well. Chlorothalonil is one that is used to treat both those diseases. Organic formulations like a Bordeaux mixture, which I'll talk more about later, are an option if you're not interested necessarily in utilizing more conventional fungicides. But in any case, with fungicide application, you need to be very careful to follow label directions, mix it properly, apply it under proper conditions, wear the proper personal protective equipment, so that you stay safe, and also that you don't damage the plants, because that can happen. I appear to be a bit tongue-tied today, and I apologize for that. Just summarizing sort of some of the fungal disease control measures. Rotating crops, sometimes that can be difficult within a small space. I tell people if they have common vegetable diseases and they're trying to utilize a relatively small garden space, perhaps constructing raised beds in a different location, or trying to grow your vegetables in a container for a year or two, can lessen the likelihood that those diseases will overwinter and impact your following year crop. Fall tillage is sort of the same thing as sanitation, really getting out those crop leftovers, the debris there. Don't leave decaying fruit, don't leave diseased plant material. Looking for resistance of the different varieties, selecting healthy transplanting or transplants, avoiding overhead irrigation, and then the fungicides again I mentioned. So those were fungal diseases. This is a bacterial disease known as bacterial spot, and it's relatively prevalent in Indiana as well. With this disease, you can see lesions on the leaves, the stem, as well as the fruit. The leaf lesions may eventually grow together. The fruit lesions are sort of scabby, as you can see here. This disease starts out as small water-soaked lesions. They just sort of have a clear appearance. And then they later become brown with yellow halos around the lesion. This disease is favored by temperatures of around 75 to 86. And it does require leaf wetness in order for disease to establish and be spread. Here, you know, it can persist in crop residue as well. So sanitation is important. And if you are saving seeds, you know, being very, very careful about saving from the very healthiest plants will help you. Copper products may help reduce the spread of the disease, but some bacteria, our plant pathologist, Dan Eagle, as I mentioned earlier, has done some studies. There are some bacterial strains that cause this disease that are resistant to copper products as well. So disease management can definitely be a challenge with these bacterial diseases. Just a quick summary of leaf diseases. This is early blight again, and here the bullseyes are a little more clearly visible. This is Septoria leaf spot again, and this is late blight, which is another disease that does not occur with quite as much frequency and typically occurs later in the season. It does also result in lesions on the leaves and fruit. But with all these diseases, good spacing, which allows for good airflow, don't crowd your plants, can be helpful. Don't work in your garden when it's wet, because as you're working around, you're likely to, you know, break leaves, bend leaves, which can cause areas for disease pathogens to enter the plant. And because the surfaces are wet, those pathogens are a little more mobile than they would be if the garden was dry. Pluck off diseased tissues as you notice it. Typically, those are the lower leaves first. Practice good garden sanitation at the end of the season. You water early in the day if you're using overhead watering, or use drip irrigation so the water gets to the root system and not on the leaves. And then use fungicides as needed. This will be a good place for me to mention that fungicides that are available to homeowners are preventatives. So you can protect new growth and existing growth that doesn't currently have symptoms showing with fungicide applications. But the products that are available to us as backyard gardeners are not systemic. They do nothing to cure already infected tissues. And it's important that you reapply them as directed on the label if you want to ensure continued protection, because that protection will rinse off with rain, heavy dews, and that kind of thing. Again, read the label if you're going to use any type of product like that. So from here, we're going to move on to a few disorders. So these are non-infectious plant diseases. This one's very common. If you've ever grown tomatoes, you've probably seen this one. It's known as blossom end rot. You can see the lesions forming on the blossom end of the tomato, and that's how it gets its name. This happens because there's not enough calcium getting to the fruit of the plant. There is often abundant calcium in the soil, but because of water, soil moisture inconsistencies, that calcium is not moving all the way through the plant into the fruit. So you as a gardener can do things like mulching again to hopefully moderate that soil moisture. You can water regularly and deeply throughout the summer as a supplement to Mother Nature when she's not providing us with adequate moisture. And we generally, for garden plants, an inch of water a week is what we recommend. With blossom end rot, it's typically the first fruit set that is more severely impacted. So if you're just patient, you can wait for those additional fruits to set on the vine, and they often are fine. The mobility through the plant of nutrients is sort of worked out as the season has moved along, and hopefully the water moderation is also there. Larger fruited varieties are also more likely to have blossom end rot. A lot of our heirloom varieties are larger fruited varieties. Variety selection can also cause an issue with that as well. So this is not something that will spread from plant to plant. It's not a concern throughout the growing season. Typically, it's usually that first fruit set. And variety selection, again, can help you with this. This is what's known as zipper scars, and you can see that it can go from something relatively mild like this one to significantly more severe, where it may cause the fruit to actually have a hole. Zipper scars are caused when the blossom sticks to developing fruit. And you can see right here on this picture that the leftovers of the blossom there. They're more common in cool, wet weather. The abscission layer that sort of causes the blossom to drop from the fruit doesn't develop quite as intensely when the weather is cool and wet, and so the blossom tends to hang on. There is some variation in variety. With most of us, this isn't going to impact us as home gardeners. We're all going to continue to eat that. It does not impact whether the plant is edible. With this, and maybe even with this, we might be bothered by that. So if you have selected a variety and see a lot of problems with this, maybe choose another variety. Or maybe later in the season if you're planting early in the cooler, wetter weather, or you may not actually experience that many problems if you're seeing it if you don't have cool, wet weather in any particular spring. Fruit cracking is common during hot, rainy periods that follow more extended dry spells. The fruit absorbs water and begins to grow faster than the skin, so the skin will split. So again, mulching can help retain soil moisture, also can help suppress weeds, so another bonus there. So not allowing the plants to dry out too extensively between waterings can help with this problem as well. Another disorder that you might run into is called Sunscald. This one is again caused by environmental conditions and also can potentially be caused by cultural practices. Sunscald appears as a white or yellow patch on the side or top of the fruit that is exposed to sunlight. So getting your plants trellised, tomato plants will grow on the ground, but trellising them up can help with good airflow, and it also can shade the fruit that's growing below so that sunscald doesn't happen. As you're pruning out dead material, don't go crazy pruning out suckers and other foliage as well, because that foliage can help shade fruit and prevent this problem also. Look out for tomato hornworms and that kind of thing, because the defoliation that they cause can expose the fruit to potential sunscald as well. So quite a bit that you can do to manage this disorder just by managing how your plants are growing, scouting for insect problems, etc. Cat facing is another disorder. It's usually associated with cool, cloudy weather at the time when fruit is set. And again, this happens when the blossom doesn't fall off as that fruit is set, which ends up causing a scar. There's not really anything to you can do about it. You know, it's weather related. These chunks and scars don't make the fruit inedible. If this kind of fruit comes up in my garden, I slice out the larger chunks, hopefully the larger chunks that are clear, and eat around these scars. Sometimes if you get too close to the scars, you can get a corky or off flavor. So, you know, you might just want to experiment with that. But again, it's a weather related kind of problem. With this deformed foliage that you see here, those things can be caused by several factors. Two of them one may be viruses. If you see viruses, and we'll see a slide later in cucumber of a virus impacted plant, but deformed foliage, ring spots, funky lines, not really like you see over here. Whoops, sorry. This again is early blight. But viruses can cause deformed foliage. Aphids, insect feeding, can also cause deformed foliage. And then herbicide damage. If you happen to have your garden in an area where you might get drift from a farm field next door, or even a you know, highly conscientious turf person who's managing their broadleaf weeds next door. Tomatoes in particular, and grapes also, are sensitive to a broadleaf weed killer. The active ingredient is what's known as 2,4-D. You need to do, this is where you'd put the pieces of the puzzle together. You know, do you see signs of insects? Do you see signs of insect feeding? Do you see other symptoms of viruses, which would include ring spots and squiggly lines? Or, you know, are your tomatoes located close to a field? Are you seeing it on all the tomatoes, only certain tomatoes? How you proceed here will depend on how you put that puzzle together. And it also might depend on the information that you can get from your neighbors regarding whatever kind of application they might have applied that might have impacted your plants. Sometimes, depending on the severity of application, your plants may grow out of it. Sometimes they may not. So, another disorder that you may run into is wilting. Wilting can be caused by both pathogens, but it can also be caused by things like root injury, you know, due to over-aggressive cultivation. It can be caused by black walnut toxicity. Tomato is sensitive to juglone, a hormone that is put out by black walnuts. And also there are two soil-borne fungus diseases that cause wilt, fusarium and verticillium wilt. Look for disease resistance on the varieties that you are growing, especially if you've had problems with wilt issues before. This is an example here of a wilt caused by black walnut. You can see the black walnut tree growing right here. And then you can see the wilted tomato plants right here. All parts of the black walnut tree do have juglone, but the roots have the highest concentration. So there must be some root action going on right under the plot right here. So leaf roll is another disorder that you may see. This isn't a wilt. Often people will call and say, my tomatoes are dying. they're wilting. But if we were to look at the plant, we would notice the overall plant itself still is turgid. You're just seeing this happening on the leaves. Leaf roll happens when you've had very wet soils in the spring and there's relatively cooler temperatures, and then we're exposed to more drier, hotter temperatures. The leaves will roll to sort of conserve moisture as they move into changes in water availability and heat. Nothing you can really do about this. Change variety, perhaps, if it's a problem with variety that you've had every year. But these plants, typically the leaves unroll. Even if they don't unroll, they will continue to photosynthesize and produce tomatoes, although you may get reduced yield. Heavy aphid infestations, piercing, sucking insect can also sometimes result in leaf roll. So again, put your puzzle together by looking for signs of insects if you do see this symptom of leaf roll on tomatoes. So we've run through tomatoes, and I know we've gone very quickly, but moving on to a couple other problems as we have a little bit of time left. Problems in other vegetables. A common problem that you might see is wilt. This is a bacterial wilt of muskmelon. You also see it on cucumber. A lot of times home gardeners do grow cucumbers more often than they grow muskmelon, which is also known as cantaloupe. But the leaves, you'll see wilt symptoms. So, you know, the plant will lose turgidity, fall over, you know, will not be upright anymore. The leaves will turn yellow and brown, sometimes completely withering and dying. Wilt typically progresses down the vine until the entire vine wilts or dies. This disease is spread by both spotted and striped cucumber beetles, which you can see right up here. They're in the process of mating right there. The bacteria overwinter in the gut of these guys and can be spread by the feces that they deposit. So their poop or frass can spread it around, and it can enter the plant through wounds that way. It can also enter as they go about feeding. These insects have piercing, sucking mouth parts. So they pierce into one plant, suck the plant juices. If that happens to be a diseased plant and they move on to a healthy plant, they can transmit the disease in that way. So it really isn't any kind of antibiotic or anything that you can apply for either cucumber or muskmelon. This does occasionally occur in things like squash, but less likely to occur. If you want to confirm that this is what's going on as far as the wilt disease and not something else, hopefully if we can get this video to play, it will show this gummy goo that is actually a sign of the bacteria that will be present in the stem if you make a sharp cut in the stem and then try to pull it apart. Let's see if this will work. So he's pushing it together, and then as he pulls it apart, hopefully you can see those little strings coming with it. And that's actually a polysaccharide goo that is a sign of the bacteria. So you can try that test in your own garden if you see wilted cucumber and you're trying to really define what's going on. One more view here. I did see a question pop up real quick, how to keep cucumber beetles to a minimum. You can control cucumber beetles with insecticide. You can also monitor their population by putting out sticky traps. They're attracted to yellow, so gardening supply companies will sell these yellow cards that you can put out in your garden and sort of help you monitor populations. If populations are low, you're less likely to have problems. Hopefully you can see that string of goo here also. So that does happen. You know, we do get calls regularly about my cucumbers have wilted, what's going on. So, and that would be the first suspect as far as wilt diseases go with either cucumbers or muskmelons. Here, this is another fungal disease. In this case, it's occurring on pepper. This is what's known as anthracnose, excuse me. It also can occur on tomato and eggplant. Rain splash in this instance provides favorable conditions for the disease spores to move from the soil to the plant. So again, mulching can help reduce the problem. In this case, you can actually see the fungal spores developing. So that is a sign. You know, it's not the plant reaction in this case. You can actually see the fungal spores developing right there. Ripe and overripe fruit are particularly susceptible. So harvesting when plants are in their fruits are in their prime rather than waiting for things to be overripe before you harvest. The initial symptoms that you would see would be small, circular, and depressed, and then you'd get further development in these fungal spores. With this one, crop rotation does help. You wouldn't want to grow another plant in this Solanaceae family or nightshade family. So tomatoes, potatoes, eggplant, where you've seen this disease develop for 3 to 4 years. And then if it's a continual ongoing problem, fungicide applications would be recommended as the first fruit set and develop, and also important as the fruit ripens. So chlorothalonil is a common fungicide that is used for this. We'll have several pictures here of another really common plant disease. Running out of time, so I'll flip through these quickly. This is powdery mildew. You see it on cucumbers, muskmelon, pumpkin, squash, and in this case, this is actually in a retail outlet where they were on the transplants. So inspecting those transplants is important so that you do not have that occur. Good airflow, again, crop rotation, crop sanitation when it's a problem, looking for resistance to powdery mildew is another control recommendation. And then fungicides, again, sort of the last on the list of control measures. This is what's known as black rot of cruciferous vegetables. If you see this occur, it occurs on things like cabbage, kale, Brussels sprouts. You'll see notches. You can see one developing here, and then here they're typically V-shaped notches that appear as this disease develops. Here it's important to look for good quality certified seed. There is a hot water seed treatment if you're saving your seed that can help prevent the disease moving from one generation to another. Copper products can provide some control, but if you notice this disease late, the amount of control is somewhat limited. Look for, again, resistant varieties, and again, also look for healthy transplants in the garden center. One I wanted to mention, oh, there's more black rot. You can see again the V-shaped notches, maybe even a little clearer here. And as the disease continues to develop, this is what you would notice. It does persist in the soil, so crop rotation is important. I think this is my last, two more. Corn smut. is one. If you grow sweet corn, you're likely to encounter. This is what's known as a gall. This is a symptom definition of a gall is a swollen area. It's the plant. It's both the plant and the fungus together here in this gall. It looks like a tumor. They always used to freak me out when I run around in our sweet corn patch as a kid. But it's not super common. Typically, you might see it on an ear or two. You usually don't find it throughout your garden. It does vary by variety, so looking for varieties that are resistant to it will help it. There are also varieties that are susceptible to it. And sometimes people want to actually produce corn smut. It is eaten as a almost a delicacy, like we prefer morels. In Hispanic cultures, corn smut is something that is favorable. The white sugary enhanced flavors are the most resistant to corn smut. And if you want specific variety information, we can share that with you. I wanted to mention one virus disease and give you some other pictures. This is cucumber mosaic virus, which is the virus that I have typically seen on cucumbers. You will get these funny ring spots and funky lines. Viruses are systemic. There is no way to treat this plant once it is infected with the virus. So the plant actually needs to be removed from your garden so that it does not spread to other plants. Typically, viruses are often spread by vectors, but they can be spread by us and, you know, your cat or dog in the yard. Lots of ways. Just anytime you're in contact with plants and plant debris, you can potentially spread disease. Quickly running through fungicides, fungicides in general. This ortho garden disease control. It's not that we're necessarily recommending ortho, but their products are readily available. And you can see here, stops and prevents over 130 diseases. This one, when we talk about products, we often talk about active ingredient, and those are listed typically on the front of the product in very small print down in the lower left corner of the label. And you'll want to bring your magnifying glass or readers to see what you're looking for as far as the active ingredient. I've mentioned a couple times chlorothalonil as a fungicide that can treat some of the diseases that we've gone over today. So this is an example of what you'd look for. Again, reading all the label directions, what it can be applied to, when it can be applied, how often it needs to be reapplied, how often the re-entry time is, if there's any kind of harvest interval, which means you can't go in and pick the plants after an application for a set period of time. Re-entry interval would be even going back into the garden for a specific set of time, what kind of personal protective equipment you should wear, etc. Here's another one. Another Bayer products are very commonly available. Cures and prevents diseases, powdery mildew being one listed here. And this is, wrong way. This is a concentrate, so you mix this on your own, makes up to 42 gallons. So pay attention to the recommendations of what you do while you're mixing it as well. And here again, the active ingredient, and often the active ingredient actually makes up a relatively small percentage of the pesticide. It is often a large percentage in their inert ingredients. Bordeaux mixture. This is one of the copper products that I mentioned. In this case, Bordeaux mixture contains copper and lime sulfur. This would be an organic product, but again, organic doesn't necessarily mean free for all, everything's safe. Organic, especially copper products, can cause phytotoxicity, meaning applying them at the wrong time, under the wrong conditions can damage plant tissue, damage the leaves. Copper toxicity can also be a problem. You can build up too much copper in your soil, so that's something to be aware of. But they can be quite effective, either Bordeaux mixture mixed with the lime or straight copper fungicides. This is another organic pesticide that you might encounter. This one is basically hydrogen peroxide, listed under the trade name of oxidate. It is hydrogen peroxide and peroxyacetic acid. It also controls a number of different diseases, as you can see, but again, it's a preventative. So you would be applying it prior to symptoms and then reapplying it throughout the growing season. A couple of quick resources I want to mention, and we will send a list of others, but the Midwest Vegetable Guide here, which is a website, you can pick your crop, pick your diseases, and then look for control measures. This is really designed for commercial growers, but still, you know, looking at crops and what kind of pests you're dealing with. Good information for home gardeners. Some of the control measures may be restricted to those folks who have pesticide licenses. So this part of it may be less useful for you, but still a good resource. And we're all here available to you as a resource person in your county or wherever you may be located. The Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab is a resource. You can submit a physical sample along with digital pictures for $11. A plant pathologist will look at your sample, culture it if needed, and provide control recommendations. You can also look at the what's hot or picture of the week section and get an idea of issues that others may be seeing in their gardens, and they may be having the same issue you are. So it may be a help to get you to a diagnosis for your problem. I mentioned that I would mention this again at the end of the program. On or around May 28th, you will receive an email from Jenna Smith, who's been sending out all the notifications for this program. It will be a link to a survey, and it will be your opportunity to provide feedback to us about this program and what kind of future programming you'd be interested in. And we'll use your comments and responses to develop reporting and impact data that we share with our stakeholders, as I mentioned. And this is really important for us, and it shouldn't take you, I would say, 5-10 minutes. So please do look for the email and take the time to share your thoughts with us. And I want to say thank you for your attention and encourage you to keep in touch with your local educator. We do have some additional programs planned as a group, but we're also often offering programs on a county level. Our upcoming group program is Best Practices for Backyard Chickens, which actually starts next Thursday again, same time frame as this gardening webinar series. And then our colleagues in Vermilion, Clay and Owen, Bob and Phil are teaming up together to do a tick and Lyme disease webinar on Tuesday, May 19th in the evening. So thank you. And we'll move to questions now. I'm sorry, I'm not very good at keeping time.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, can hear you.
All right, thank you very much, Amy. Very informative. We do have a few questions that were not answered in the chat box, so we will go ahead and get to those. There's a question about adding calcium to tomato plants. Is there something that can be purchased to add to tomatoes for additional calcium?
So there are products out there. Their effectiveness is really the question. Again, it's an issue of calcium not getting to the fruit. So some of the sprays that are available are actually sprays that you spray on the fruit. I don't believe they've proven to be very effective. I believe there's still a significant amount of blossom end rot that occurs even with the use of these sprays. And typically, people are applying them after they see the blossom end rot symptoms. And the symptoms, as I mentioned, typically go away as that second flush or continuing flushes of fruit happen on indeterminate tomatoes. A soil test is always a good idea to see if your soil might be calcium deficient, but it's more about nutrient movement through the plant than it is about availability. At least that's often the case.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, how many years does it take for the black walnut juglones to disappear from the soil after the tree has been cut down?
Right. So I don't have a good number. I don't know if anybody else has a number, but as soon as the tree dies, that stump and those roots will put their energy into putting up shoots, and then it will begin to decay. But if you've ever had a tree stump that you're waiting for decay in your yard, it can be quite a while. So I don't know if any of the other panelists have a year that they feel comfortable sharing. I don't know of one off the top of my head.
Amy, this is Bob Bruner here. Little research on it. Iowa State Extension has an article on this subject. If the tree has been completely removed from the soil, it can take juglone up to 2 months after the living tree has been removed to fully break down. And obviously that is dependent on there being no plant material there to continue to produce it.
And it would also be dependent on things like temperature and soil moisture, because that drives decay as well. So lots of factors thrown in there. So
Is that, Bob, does that meaning completely remove the roots? Because of course you have the feeder roots, and I think if you take those feeder roots and if you do some tillage where those feeder roots are, that's supposed to help decrease the juglones also. And then also I think there's some research that if you raise the pH in that area with some lime, that can reduce the juglones in that area also.
The article doesn't get quite that specific on roots. I personally would just err on the side of caution and say any and all plant material associated with the walnuts should be removed. It does also add that any wood chips that exist from it, it could take up to 6 months for any remaining wood chips to fully break down and not have any remaining juglone as a part of that tissue. I'll actually go ahead and put a link to the article in our chat so people can read it.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Amy, let's see. Here's a question. How many percent, what percent of tomato suckers should you trim off per plant?
Again, you all feel free to chime in. Sucker pruning is something I grew up doing. Something my dad always did. I have read research that it does not improve or impact yield, but it could potentially improve airflow and therefore lessen the likelihood of disease problems. So, if you feel like your plants aren't getting good airflow because they've got a lot of other foliage, I don't think there's a specific number of suckers to prune off. But if you're doing it to increase yield necessarily, if airflow is not a problem, I'm not sure it's worth doing. Like I said, anybody else chime in on that if they have other thoughts to share.
Okay, hearing none. One last question, maybe. Can you put anything in the hole before planting your tomatoes to help fight diseases? You have that magic, that silver bullet.
I do not have a magic silver bullet. I would say, doing good garden prep, putting the plant in at the right time, like I mentioned, soil temperatures, just doing everything you can to ensure that you're creating an environment for vigorous plant growth, are the best things to do. There's some alternating, theories on, like I worked in California with a guy who swore by putting banana peels in the bottom of his tomato hole every year. Actually end up tying up nitrogen. Microbes are in charge of the release, consumption. They both consume and release nitrogen. And so if you put like raw organic matter in the hole with the plant, that could actually increase the number of microbes, which would tie up potentially quite a bit of nitrogen that might otherwise be available to plants. So blah, 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 blah. Ramble. Not got a lot of good information on that. So in general, I would say no. I would do other things to make the growing situation the best it could be for your plant.
We had another question that popped up. How effective are eggshells around tomatoes for blossom end rot?
So I've read something recently that just putting eggshells in your garden really doesn't do anything because the calcium is not available for uptake. If you wanted to try and add calcium to your garden via eggshells, you would actually need to put them in a blender and create a slurry and blend them up and then apply it. And even at that point, if you already have adequate calcium in your soil, adding additional calcium is not going to impact the blossom end rot because it's really about the plant's ability to take up and move that calcium from the soil to the fruit. So I would invest in a soil test before I'd invest in a lot of time of, trying to figure out the best way to apply eggshells to alleviate the problem. That would be my take on it.
Okay, that looks like that's the last question. Is you have any final parting words of wisdom, Amy, or we
Well, thanks to you that hung with us through the questions, and I again apologize I went over. I was trying to eliminate slides this morning to make sure I stayed within the hour and obviously failed. So my apologies.
Okay, well, thank you, Amy. Yes, we will conclude the webinar and for the emails, the recording and the surveys.